Hey, folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. You've got Mr. Tyler here, as well as myself, Brad.
Hello.
And we've got a pretty fun episode for you guys. We're talking about um, multi-factor authentication, aka MFA. That was a lot of letters, and we're gonna talk about issues with MFA, right? And why it's not the magical silver bullet thing that a lot of people think seem to think that it is, if I can English. And so the title of the episode is MFA Bang Equals Secure. That's a little joke for you guys who understand coding. And so MFA, I think from a widely used perspective, is only really been seen in the last, I don't know, maybe 5 years, right? Like when you started pen testing, did everybody have MFA?
No, it was definitely not as common as it is now.
Yeah,
I think now it's forced on every single endpoint on every single account I see because it's so essential.
yeah, yeah. So I mean, literally, we're talking like in the last 5-10 years, we've seen a extreme proliferation of MFA across everybody's footprint, right? I think that kind of started with the zero trust concept, as much as I dislike that phrase. But yeah, so I guess what I'm trying to get at here is it's pretty safe to assume that most organizations have implemented MFA across their external footprint. Is that fair?
Yes, yeah. I'd say that 99% of organizations have MFA across the board.
Good. Yeah. I think it was in December of last year. We actually ran into a client who was like, "Yeah, we don't have MFA yet," and I was like, "Bro,
Yeah, there's some
2024."
exceptions to that. So law firms are particularly difficult to get MFA enabled on because lawyers don't like change.
Yeah.
So trying to get MFA on lawyer devices, I think, has
Yeah.
been a challenge that I've seen. Another way I've seen a challenge is at, SaaS apps that aren't SSO integrated. A lot
Yeah.
of the times organizations lack MFA on those.
Yep. That's actually a really good observation because I can think of several scenarios specifically where we have found non-MFA endpoints for clients, and in most cases, like you said, it's cloud hosted SaaS stuff. I think another common example is like hospitals,
Mhm.
healthcare organizations, because they just have so much legacy stuff, right? Like for whatever reason, I don't know why. Maybe they're not even unique in the world, but it feels like they are because they seem to have like a plethora of 20-year-old junk that is still providing patient care, but still uses Telnet for authentic. You know what I mean? Like something
Mhm.
crazy like that. So, or in a lot of cases, like you said, with the SaaS stuff, it's similar with legacy stuff, like where there is no MFA support. So, I do think that we are reaching a point very quickly where MFA is no longer a question. It's really how well is it done? And that's one of the conversations that we frequently have with our clients during kickoff or maybe even like pre-sales or whatever. And that is like, all right, cool, you got MFA, right? Yeah, yeah, I do. Okay. Is it uniformly applied across your entire user base or your entire application portfolio? Okay, cool. Are you using push notifications?
Mhm.
How are you guys handling that, right? What about fallback mechanisms? And so we're going to talk about all this stuff in today's episode. But I kind of, just spent like 2 minutes leading up to the point to say this, right? MFA is not equal to MFA, right? So there's good MFA and there's bad MFA, and then there's really bad MFA. So we're going to talk about that today. So Tyler, what is MFA? Why? I mean, we already know why it's important, right? I
Mhm.
hope, but let's just quickly touch on those users or those listeners out there that are not, up to date on stuff. Let's give that at least a nod.
So MFA is gonna be your secondary access control. After you enter a username and a password into an application, you're gonna be prompted for a secondary form of authentication, whether that be in the form of a notification to your phone, a six-digit text code you get, or, an application that you use that you have to type in a code.
Yeah, yeah, completely agree with that. So, um, the whole M in the MFA, multi-factor authentication, what we're trying to do is bolt on something because at the end of the day, passwords suck from a security perspective, right? They are just awful. But our entire world is built on passwords. So in an attempt to try to solve that, we're like, hey, let's just add another authentication mechanism on top of it that is not a password. It's not something that you know. right? It's something that you have. And so that's really where we're changing, right? You got to have whatever that thing is that generates that code as a secondary method of authentication, like you said. So obviously, its real world importance is like, yeah, we need to try to maybe protect this stuff, right?
Mhm.
So that's pretty straightforward, I think, for most folks. So I know you have seen some insecure MFAs in your travels as a pen tester. So tell me about some of the like, things you've run into that made MFA not so awesome.
Yeah,
Maybe
let's
some
talk about a
insecure.
common MFA method people still use that's not really talked about, and that's security questions. So after
Oh
you
my
log into
gosh,
your account, you get a question,
dude, I
"Hey."
totally forgot about that. I'm so glad you brought that up. It's not even in
Yeah,
the show notes, dude.
yep, yep. "What was your first dog's name?" I'm gonna go to your Facebook profile, and I'm going to
Yeah.
stalk the shit out of you until I
Yep.
find what Fido's name was back in '01,
Yep.
and then I'm going to answer that security question, and suddenly I have access to your account. Because security questions are insecure because that is mainly public information that they're asking you, and people love to overshare on the internet because they want everybody to know what's going on, and I
Yep.
love that. I love that.
As
So,
an attacker, you love that, yeah.
yes, yes.
But and another thing too, a lot of it's easily guessable too. Like, what's your favorite color? Like, dude, if you're a male, give me 3 tries. I'm in,
Mhm.
right? But I wanna point something out to a lot of people, and by the way, I don't know why, but it seems like insurance companies really love, um, the security questions as a mechanism to supplement username and password. I don't know why, but that seems to be something. Let me point this out. That is not MFA. Like, by definition, you are using a password, which is something you know, and
Mhm.
you're answering a security question, which is something you know. It's no longer MFA at that point. It's just double password
It's double
authentication.
password
That's really
authentication,
what it
yep.
is, right? And so having that, and we're going to talk about fallback mechanisms as part of this later on. But you're right. I have seen that. In fact, in my travels working in the financial world, there were many times where we at the bank had to go to bat against vendors who were implementing the security question as air quotes MFA. So I'm really glad you brought that up. That actually is something I didn't think to talk about, and it's a really good observation.
Yeah, I'd say that's
So,
probably the most insecure, and that's the one that everybody's moving away from,
oh yeah,
but I
it's
think
it's
when it
more
was
rare
first
now.
adopted, everybody thought, "This is good, this is easy," um, and
Well,
now
it was
now
easy.
when people are looking at it, it's still easy, but it's easy for everybody now.
Oh yeah, no, I completely agree. I completely agree, and that kind of rolls into the next bullet, right? Well, actually, you know what? Before we get out of weak implementations, let's talk a little bit about SMS. So what are your thoughts on like getting a text message with the security code or an email with a security code that you have to use for MFA?
Both of those devices can be listened to via phishing. So smishing is a way to get SMS codes from people. Phishing is a way to get email codes from people. So you just man in the middle somebody, and suddenly you have those codes since they're just going to devices
Yeah.
that a user uses.
Yep. And I'll add to that with this, right? What level of assurance do you have that the bad guy doesn't already have access to those things, right? So the whole point of MFA, remember, is post initial username and password authentication. Well, if I already have your username and password, there's a reasonably good chance I may have access to your email, or I may be able to gain access to your phone via whatever method. Like you said, smishing
Mhm.
is good. So by sending this token out, we're giving the bad guys an opportunity to pick it up.
Mhm.
I would say, in order of insecurity, it would be like, security questions, email MFA, text MFA, and then we start getting into actually reliable methods. And I haven't talked about push yet, but that one's going to be the next less, or the next better one, but still bad, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and
Uh,
something I wanna mention is how many people are getting MFA off of phones that aren't enrolled into mobile device management.
like Intune and stuff like that. Yeah,
Mhm.
it's a really
So
good
people
point.
are just using their phones for work and personal purposes, and
Yeah.
that just opens you up for a whole new avenue of attacks to abuse and get your phone hacked.
Yep.
So,
Completely agree with that. Um, and if you add to that, the fact that a lot of people browse on their phones, They check their personal email on the phone that they also have their work email on, and so you start creating a scenario where, I get a free gift card to my Gmail account. I click on it, my phone's popped.
Perfect storm
Or
for an attacker.
exactly, exactly. So yeah, man, that tracks 100%. Um, so I'm gonna switch these next two things. I want to talk about single factor bypass
Mhm,
before we talk about fallback methods. So let's talk about single factor bypass during setup or recovery process. Many, many, many times in our external penetration tests, we will pop an account, we will go to authenticate to that account, and we will be asked to enroll in MFA. Love that, dude. Love that as
mhm,
a bad guy, hate that from a defensive perspective. And so what ends up happening in this scenario is we create a policy in whatever policy management tool that we have that says everybody gets MFA. And the first time they log in, they're going to enroll in MFA and then they're totally awesome, right?
mhm,
But what happens when they don't enroll? Right? What happens when they're a on-prem only user like in the office and they never remotely log into a system? That opens up an opportunity now for the bad guys to enroll. And so, we see this a lot, unfortunately, on higher level employees, right? Like executives. Executives don't always, in larger organizations, check their own email from home, right? They have a secretary, they have somebody who manages the email, tells them what they have going on. And so, there's a lot of scenarios where an employee at an organization will not remotely authenticate
mhm,
and therefore will never set up for the first time. So we do, we'll do it for you,
mhm.
right?
Yep.
We love that.
Yeah, another thing is the enrollment enforcement gaps, because 'cause we'll see organizations deploy their
Yes.
MFA, and then they're like, "You have 90 days to set this up. If you don't wanna set it up today, you can skip it."
Mhm.
And they have that option available to them. Well, it's easier to get to my email without having to pull out my phone, scan this QR code, put in an MFA code, and set it up for the first time. So for 89 days, I am going to skip that process. Well, if at any point an attacker gets your password, they're now gonna set that up and you have no way to access your account
Yep, or
and
they'll
you're
skip it
popped.
too, and they're now inside your email inbox.
Right, right.
Which, by the way, super convenient because guess where my recovery codes are probably stored?
Email
Bingo,
or text
right? So
document on a
so so I
computer that we now have access to.
right, right. So I find the recovery process to be interesting for MFA, right? So let's talk about what the recovery process is, how it's commonly implemented, and then why it's a bad thing in a lot of cases. So for those of you that don't know, an MFA recovery process is basically like, hey, I've lost access to something. I've lost access to my secondary authentication mechanism. It could be that you dropped your phone broke and it had the app on it, right? Or you're fishing and it slips off the boat, right? Happens to me every weekend. So, so now I no longer have. So what do I do? Right? What do I do with that? And so, in a lot of cases, you could just call IT support. Maybe they can reset it for you. But in many cases, they're gonna when you initially enroll, you are provided with a series of strings or tokens or whatever that allow you to recover it. So if you put that in your password, it just skips MFA and you re-enroll.
Mhm,
The problem is where do you store that? And you kind of hinted at it a minute ago, like on your computer in a text file, like that's super secure. Do you put that in your, password manager? Well, that's cool until you lose access to the password manager because it's MFA to the device that's sitting at the bottom of
mhm,
the lake, right? There's not really a good answer to be completely frank, right? If you're leveraging recovery processes with these text strings, you know, first of all, half the time the user is going to forget where they put them because they're going to lose access a year
mhm.
after they were provided with these recovery codes. So it's
Yep.
really not solving the problem effectively. But the bigger problem is users are beautiful about storing stuff in the most insecure way possible. So there's a 99% chance those recovery codes are either in their email or, like you said, sitting on disk somewhere. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, because those strings are complicated. It's the same thing with user passwords. If they have 8 different passwords because they can't use the same password across 8 different applications, we're gonna find those, and
Yep.
they're gonna do the same thing with recovery codes. Because sometimes you'll get, 10 different strings of random words. You're never gonna remember that. You have to store that somewhere, and sometimes even the vendors that give you those codes offer to download those to a text file. That's convenient. Now that's on the user's endpoint,
Yeah.
and we have access to all that to reset.
Yep.
So, it's just a systemic problem with users and making things hard to remember and easy to forget.
Agreed 100%, man. Um, the other common fallback method that we see, or recovery method, if you will, is email. Like, hey, I can't get into my account. Send me a link to my email. Just same as what we've already talked about, right? Like, dude, if you're storing in an email, there's a potential for us to get it, and that's not cool. So keep that in mind. Um,
Yeah, and on that note, Microsoft Authenticator, even as one of the most prevalent that we use, you can say, I don't have access to my MFA device right now. And even if it sends you a number, you'll be able to go through a backup method. And I
SMS,
think, yeah, you can
mail,
SMS, mail,
phone
all
call.
options, depending on what your organization has enabled.
Yep, 100% agree with that. So something to take away from this episode is, what are your fallback methods? What are your backup and recovery methods? And are they secure, right? So if you're sending an SMS as a backup to reset it on a non-managed device, you got a problem. Um, so we already kind of talked about single factor bypass during setup recovery process. That kind of rolls into what we just talked about. But let's talk about push notifications, right? Because we're going to beat this one to death today. What's your beef with push notifications in MFA implementation?
Every common vendor I've seen from Duo to Microsoft to anyone has the option for push notifications. You're going to send a yes no prompt to a user's device. They'll be able to click one button and they have access to their account. That's easy.
That's easy. I
Everybody
love
likes
it, man.
easy.
What's wrong with that?
I love easy. Easy's not rate limited, meaning I can just sit there all day and press that button and continue to send them. And eventually they're going to get pissed off. And then either they're going to go to IT and IT is going to block my IP and I'm no
Mhm,
longer going to be able to send them push notifications, or they're going to accept it
mhm.
and I'm in their device because I
Yep,
annoyed them.
love it. So there's a point at which it gets too easy, right? And users will authorize the behavior without knowing what they're doing. Um, we've seen some success with that in external pen testing, right? We'll usually pop an account, call the client, hey, I got Susie's account. Do you mind if we push bomb her? We do. She lets us in. We're done, right? Now it's an internal pen test. So yeah, I mean, push notifications are just not ideal. And so, I don't think we really get into alternatives to push notifications.
Mhm.
But let's talk about that just really briefly. Sam Killingsworth on our team, he's an external pen tester on our team, just wrote a great white paper on why push notifications are the wrong answer. And that's actually going to be released at the same time as this episode. So if you're listening to this episode, go check out offsec.blog. There's a white paper that you can use to kind of check yourself and also use as ammunition to enforce change in your organization. I definitely encourage you guys to check that out. But all right, so I set it up. Tyler, tell me why number matching is better than push notifications. And tell me what number
So,
matching is, by the way.
number matching is you'll get an app on your phone. When you go in that app to set up MFA, it's going to say, hey, enter the number that's displayed on your screen.
Mhm.
And in Teams, Outlook, whatever, there's going to be a number. You put that in your app, and then you're able to access your account. I've seen implementations of number matching that I don't like. Some number matching will give you the option of picking between three different numbers, and you have to choose the right one that's displayed on your screen. Well, you've just given an attacker a 33% chance to get into that account. So the most
I
secure
like that.
is
Yeah,
you have
that's
to
smart.
enter the number that's on your screen.
So why okay, so when you say that though, there's more to it, right? So like you are being presented with a number that then has to
Mhm.
be input into the application as the
Correct.
MFA mechanism. The
Mhm.
reason I love that so much though is because the user cannot accidentally authenticate that.
Right.
Like if they're not sitting in front of the browser like we are, right? We're the bad guy,
Mhm.
we pop the account, we sent the auth request. They can't see our browser, so they can't put the number in. We can't see the number, so we can't put the number in. So like there's a big disconnect
Mhm.
that is impossible other than like tricking the user into giving us the code. Like we can't get past that. Right. And so I agree with you that there are good and bad, maybe good and less good implementations of
Mhm.
number matching in MFA. But currently today, as we sit here, number matching is the superior implementation of MFA. Would you agree with
Correct.
that? Okay.
Correct.
Good, good. So,
And I'll give you a story on why number matching is good. I had an engagement with a client a few weeks ago. I managed to pop 4 different accounts.
Mhm.
and they gave me free reign to work with 3 of those accounts.
Okay.
I tested MFA on those accounts. They were MFA'd across the board. So my next step was, "Hey, can I try and abuse, prompt bombing?" And what I figured out was they had number matching, and so all 3 users that I sent prompts to with number matching prompts all reported it to IT because they didn't have a number sitting in front of them or on their phone, so they knew it wasn't them. So it's an extra indicator that,
Mm.
okay, maybe I got signed out of Teams on my phone, it sent me a push notification, I'll accept that. But if you get signed out of Teams on your phone and you have number matching, you'll get a number on your phone and you will know this is yours.
Yep. So yeah, at that point, you couldn't put the number in anything if you wanted to. So like
Right,
something's up, right?
right.
I love it, man. Yeah, I completely agree with you. 100%. So what kind of attacks or exploitation methods are we seeing against MFA? Let's kind of step into that, right? Currently today, the most reliable way to defeat number matching or any kind of even good implementation of MFA is through social engineering, right? We're going to trick the user into um, either, like you said, clicking the push or into giving us the code, right? But the only way that you can do that is through social engineering for the most part, right? Like we're going to talk about some different things, but that's really the primary way bad guys are getting in. And they're doing that through phishing for the most part. We're phishing for MFA codes. There are some really cool frameworks for you guys out there listening. Go check out some of the MFA phishing frameworks. Like there are very, very well designed methods for phishing MFA, and a lot of it is open source and freely available. So you can imagine that there are much more advanced techniques beyond that too, right? That the bad guys are keeping close to the vest. So that's really, you know, social engineering and then push notification fatigue. Those are really the two primary ways that bad guys are getting around MFA right now. You also talked about like the lack of deployment, and I actually had a thought about that. I want to go back to
Mhm.
when you enable MFA, you do it through policies, right? And you usually will do it through policies in your identity management platform, right? That might be Active Directory, that might be Azure, AD, whatever it is.
Mhm.
And so the problem with that is if you apply it at the wrong place, there may be exclusions. And we have run into this many times on external pen tests where we ask them during kickoff, hey, do you have MFA applied? And they're like, yeah, we're like, you have applied across the board. And they're like, absolutely, yes. Turns out there's an executive group that is excluded from that policy. Whether it was intentional or unintentional is not important, but there was an executive group excluded from that policy. Weak password. We log straight into their email. Boom, right? So just because you checked the box of applying MFA across your environment, that doesn't mean it's always there. And so, keep that stuff in mind, like how you apply this matters, where you apply this matters. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, that's really all there is to it from that perspective. But let's skip down to hijacking. So, at the end of the day, MFA is part of a robust authentication mechanism that gives you something that you present to an application, right?
Mhm.
Usually, it's in the form of a session. But in our pre-show talk, you talked about bearer tokens. It's a really good point.
Yep.
But basically, you're going to be provided with a session that is generally speaking a header that's going to be passed back and forth in your browser.
Yep.
What's interesting about that is we have dozens, if not hundreds of ways to access that session. We can implement, stored cross-site scripting on a target site that we know you're going to visit, the watering hole style attack.
Mhm.
We can phish you, and through phishing you, have you visit a site or load code that will steal that session from your browser or your cache or whatever. And I guess the point that I want to get at here is after authentication, the only thing protecting you from being that session from being hijacked is that token and you protecting that token. So if I can get it, I've effectively bypassed MFA at that point. Now there are mechanisms out there, especially in the JWT world, that refresh tokens periodically. But
Mhm.
we're going to talk about that later on when we start talking about mitigation strategies. But keep in mind, right? I just want everybody to understand that we're going to spend all this money, time, effort training users, implementing technologies. At the end of the day, all you're getting is this little code that's going to get passed back and forth between the device and the server. And if I can get that, I don't even need MFA, right?
Yep.
So keep that in mind.
Yep, and we can also like, these attacks can be as sophisticated as attackers wanna make them. A
Yeah.
lot of the times, attackers are gonna take the lazy approach because that's easy. They want easy targets, but we can combine vulnerabilities like cross-origin resource sharing policies that are overly permissive,
Yeah.
stand up our own web server, and just have your users authenticate there. We'll backend authenticate to your identity server that has
Mhm.
this cores vulnerability, exchange credentials, send back a prompt for MFA to them, and then we're in their account completely, and they're none the wiser.
Yep. Yep. So you're getting deep dive on a technical stuff, and I want to talk about cores for a minute because I do think it's important to understand. Cross-origin resource sharing is a policy enabled on a web server that effectively allows third-party or external websites to remotely interact with that website. So it allows you to potentially front end using a phishing platform or whatever, um, the real authentication server, right? And if I can trick a user into visiting my site, then I'm actually doing real authentication. The user is interacting with their real identity server on the back end, but I control that entire session. I'm effectively man in the middle of that session. And then once they've authenticated, I have exactly what we just described, right? We stolen their session post authentication. So yeah,
And Coors is not bad. Coors has legitimate reasons. A lot of the
yeah,
times we see overly permissive policies, and then we also see policies that have a header called access control allow credentials.
yep,
And if that's set to true, then we can send credentials backwards and forth between the server we're interacting with. If that's set to false, we cannot send credentials. So
yep.
that
Or if they're locking the core's policy to specific domains, which is what it was
correct.
designed to do. The problem is if you flip cores on and do not change anything, it defaults to allow all and allow credentials, which is bad news, right? So now we literally don't even need to build a phishing back end. We just need to build a front end to interact with your back end. You
Yep.
just made our job really easy. So yeah, no, that makes perfect sense, man. Um, so let's talk about some real world stuff, right? When has this actually happened, and how did it happen? So, about a couple of months ago, right? Depending on when you're listening to this, this was December of 2024. Microsoft Azure's MFA system did not have rate limiting on the one-time passwords. So what that means is that I can attempt to log in using an OTP. Um, Within a certain time period as many times as I want. And I think the time period at the time was like 3 minutes, right? How many requests can you send in 3 minutes, dude? Tens of thousands,
Yeah, a
right?
lot.
A
A
lot.
lot.
And that's assuming that you can't have multiple authentication sessions at the same time. So why don't I
Mhm.
spin up like every 13 seconds, I'll spin up a new 3-minute window that I'll then get, 15, 25,000 requests in. And these numbers were not particularly long. They were 6 digits. And so even though that's, still substantial, it's not enough to prevent us from having some success. And so that's really what happened in Microsoft. And by the way, I think we can all agree that Microsoft kind of is the standard for MFA currently. So for them, even at the top of the pile, to have such a glaring vulnerability is kind of wake up call, right? So yeah, so that's basically what the attackers were doing is they were just leveraging this window and the lack of rate limiting to just spam OTPs until they got it right. And so these guys were getting 50% success over 70 minutes using this technique, and that is substantial.
The scarier thing to me is that's not a new vulnerability that they just introduced.
Mhm.
Like, Microsoft by default does not have rate limiting on a lot of their applications, so you can just sit there and spam.
Yeah,
That's been out there in the wild. It's just now been figured out and exploited back in December. Um, so that's even scarier because we don't know what other MFA providers are doing. Hopefully, they look at this and also implement rate limiting if they don't already have it, but
yep.
these things
And
exist out there for a long time.
from my perspective, this illustrates the need to have third party validation, right? So like what that's literally what we do on an external pen test is we're checking everything. Even big manufacturers or big providers, we frequently find vulnerabilities. In the past, we've discovered vulnerabilities on things like Mimecast that were not previously disclosed, right? We found vulnerabilities on like authentication servers, which I'm not going to name here, but like even though you're buying from somebody like Microsoft, they are not immune to having issues. And, your implementation needs to be tested. And that's literally what we're doing on external pen tests. So, all right. So that has been solved, by the way. They have stricter rate limits. I don't think those numbers are disclosed, probably intentionally,
Mhm.
but that's a good thing. Rate limiting is something we probably find on 70+% of the APIs and web pen tests that we do, where we can hit the off endpoint. And I think with the turbo intruder of burp, we're getting like a million requests over the course of maybe 15 minutes, something like that.
Yep.
So like we're hammering these endpoints without being stopped, right? So rate limiting is a real thing, and so we test for that often. So all right, moving on to the next one. In California, there was a police department that got push bombed. Right? I mean, I don't know what else to say. Like like full stop, They were leveraging push notifications. They got push bombed. Bad guys got into their M365 environment and were able to basically go in and extract sensitive information from their environment. So, there are real world cases of what we're telling you guys about that are happening, that are affecting people, affecting organizations. So this is not theoretical. This is real life, right?
Yeah, and once again, rate limiting can be a solution here because you
Yeah,
shouldn't be able to send 100 prompts within an hour time frame ever.
agreed.
There's no
Agreed.
reason for that. Additionally, you should only be able to send at max 3 prompts and have them denied before you're just either blacklisted or you can't send any more for a certain period of time.
Yeah, or lock the
Same with,
account.
like, a password, lockout policy. I think MFA lockout policies make perfect sense.
Yep. Yep. And look, here's the thing, man. If I'm prompt bombing, it means I already have the password.
Yep.
Lock the account, right? So, 100%. And we could side mission into like conditional access policies and impossible travel, and there's a million different ways. And we're not really going to get into that because we're more focused on the MFA piece. But if you're not leveraging a very robust method of identifying user behavioral characteristics, then I think you're doing it wrong, right? All right. So, what do we do about it? What are our best practices here? What are some things that we can implement from a policy and technique perspective to solve these things? The first thing, and it's not even really a best practice so much as it is just a concept that I think everybody needs to understand, and that is that MFA is a singular component in a much larger security strategy for identity and access. It's one thing. So, what we said at the beginning of the show is people are putting kind of all their eggs in this basket and they're like, oh, we got MFA, we're good. You're really not, though, because again, MFA is not MFA, right? They're not equal depending on implementation. And so, you know, you need to treat it as one component of a larger security strategy. It's no different
Mhm.
than buying a firewall, right? Like, dude, back in the late 90s, early 2000s, like people would buy a firewall and they'd have a party like, "Dude, we got security. We
Mhm.
just bought security, man. We are done," you know? And then, they don't configure it properly or whatever, right? So, each and every one of these are just singular components in a larger ecosystem, and
Mhm.
I want everybody to think about MFA in that way. It's one piece, right? Okay. So, we talked about, um, phishing MFA, right? So, what are some things that we can do about that? Like, well, how can we help defeat phishing for MFA?
You start using things like phishing-resistant options, such as FIDO2 or WebAuth, which uses biometric or hardware-based authentication to get away from, having a device that could be compromised.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Right. I'm actually enrolled in MFA on several applications that use Windows Hello. And I'm not going to get into the debate on whether Windows Hello is awesome or not, but the concept behind it, I literally have to be on my laptop and put my pin in order to complete MFA for these applications, which means if you're in North Korea, you got no chance, right? And you really can't even fish that well unless you're able to get a binary on my computer,
Mhm.
right? Or maybe you could create a web page that mimics Windows Hello. I'm sure somebody's out there doing that. But the point that I'm getting at is it's incredibly difficult. to bypass those mechanisms. And so a lot of the implementations of FIDO2 and WebAuthn are, are basically integrations, like you said, with biometrics or some form of hardware-based authentication. And at the end of the day, that's really what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to get something that you are as opposed to something that you have, right? And so that's where I think we're going to be end up going in this long term. Is I can see us going towards passwordless authentication altogether. Not that it's in a ready state today, but I think we're heading that way, and that's going to be something that you are, right. And for those of you, we've been using these phrases. For those of you that are unfamiliar with it, authentication can take place in a couple of different ways: something you know, something you have, something you are, right. Those are the most common methods of authentication. Something you are is by far the hardest to break. It's the hardest to get around, right, as
Mm.
opposed to something you have that can be phished, that can be, whatever. So it's
Stolen,
still better than
tampered in.
something you
Yep.
know, though, right. And so you kind of work up this force continuum of, you know, something you know, something you have, something you are. So
And
anyway,
it speaks to password processes. So something you know is gonna be your first input, that's gonna be your password.
mhm,
Something you have is gonna be an MFA code, and then something you are is gonna take that a step further and add that 3rd layer of security to that authentication mechanism.
completely agree. And there is another, and I love this, right? Because hardware tokens um, are funny because we used hardware tokens in the financial industry 100 years ago, right? Like not literally, but like 20 years ago, we literally had these little things that were on they generated a 6-digit code every 30 seconds. They were on your keychain, and you had to have that to even authenticate to your desk when you came into work. And especially for like VPN remote access, and that's still kind of, I think, common in some areas. I know when we were doing a physical pen test last year, we found their hardware tokens on their desk when we were going through the facility, and I was like, "When? Not for you, though."
Mhm.
And so, but their hardware tokens are absolutely fantastic. They are, in my opinion, kind of the pinnacle of implementation for MFA and security. However, they're not without problems. And what I would say is the biggest problem of all is cost. These things are not cheap. Now, we have a mention of YubiKeys in the show notes. I will say that I think that kind of helps solve that problem. Right? YubiKeys are cheap. Their implementation, there are plenty of open source implementations of those. It can be done well. So there are inexpensive ways to accomplish that, but the more traditional ways with the digital readout tokens and stuff, they're just expensive and they're hard to manage. When Jimmy's in, Western Europe somewhere and he loses his key, what are you going to do? Right? You can ship him a new one from, Wyoming,
Mhm.
right? So
Yep.
so I mean, and you got to buy them, you got to keep them in stock, you got to have staff on hand to manage them. So like, I love hardware tokens, don't love cost and challenges from a business perspective, right? And we have to take that into consideration. Organizations, generally speaking, are not security organizations; they are businesses. They are there to do business, not to be secure. Security is something that we do on the side. So, yeah, I love hardware tokens. Maybe not a great solution for everybody. So those are some good options for phishing resistant MFA. Big fan.
Mhm.
What about strengthening fallback mechanisms? Like, that's something that we've talked about as a weakness in MFA is their fallback mechanisms, right? The way that we recover if we can't get access to it, or in addition to that, the enrollment process. So, there are some ways to accomplish that. Probably not going to deep dive into that today, but that's something that you should consider. For large scale enterprises, call help desk. That's your fallback mechanism, right? We're not going to let you send a reset link to your email.
Mhm.
We're not going to send you a text. If you have a problem, you will call support and they will re-enroll you. So, I think that currently is the best solution that we have, unfortunately.
Yep. Yep. Because putting anything in email, you have to assume that the email is
Just
not already
don't.
compromised.
Just don't,
And if
man.
the email is compromised, everything you send to that email, because it's very common for SaaS. I see a lot of the times when I log into a SaaS application that's not SSO'd, it's sending me a 6-digit code to my email.
Yep.
So if an attacker gets access to my email, okay, my third party is MFA technically, but not really
Yeah.
because that implementation's weak or poor.
Well, and you kind of like, there are two classifications, broadly speaking, of MFA implementations from a user facing perspective, right? I'm trying to figure out how to word this.
Mhm.
You have employees. I work for this company. I have to use the things that I'm provided. And then you have clients, right? Like if I'm enrolled in my hospital's website
Mhm.
as a client or a I'm trying to think of the word for it, but anyway, if I'm a consumer of this product and I have to go enroll, you can't send me a hardware key,
Right.
right? And so what are you going to do? Well, the easy answer is, well, you're enrolled with your email address, right? And so we're just going to send you the token, right? That's a
Mhm.
very common implementation when you don't have control over what mechanisms can be used. So it does present a challenge, right? If you're an employee, I can make you do whatever I want, right? I'll ship
Right.
you a key, I'll do whatever I need to do. If you're a consumer of our product, like if you're going to Amazon and you want to MFA that, like, you're more than likely the answer is going to be like, here's your QR code, go
Yep.
register this in your MFA application. But that also assumes the user has MFA applications.
Mhm.
And let's be real, man. Most people who are not in this industry, like actively,
Mhm.
probably don't.
Yeah, and I'd say that 90% of those give you an option of the MFA method you wanna set as well.
They
You
do.
don't have to do QR based
Yep.
and
What do you
put a
think a user's gonna
rolling
pick?
one-time email token on, like, the
They're
easiest
gonna go with
possible
the easiest
option.
thing they
Right.
can, man. Yeah,
Right.
absolutely, dude. So no, you're absolutely right. Um, so kind of in the same umbrella of us talking about MFA being just a cog in the larger security wheel, or the security system, to me today, monitoring is the answer. And I would tell you that if you ask me about EDR or MDR or XDR or ABR. I don't even know what they're coming up with now, dude. But the
Mhm.
point is this: we will find a way around it. And when we do, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to see it? Are you going to log it? Are you going to alert it? Are you going to block my account? What are you going to do when that system becomes compromised or bypassed? So that kind of leads us into this next conversation, and that really is monitoring for suspicious MFA behavior, right? Lots of ways to do that. At the end of the day, what we're looking for, though, are behavioral characteristics. And you and I talked about this in the pre-show conversation, and we've been doing this in the banking industry for literally 15 years, 20 years. So when you go to log in online banking, if your online bank platform is worth its salt, in the background, there's JavaScript scraping information about you. What browser are you using? What geolocation are you coming from?
Mhm.
Even down to the point of how quickly you fill out the form, right? Because scripts fill out really quick, right? It's like boom, form populated, submit.
Yep.
That's not a user can't do that. They can't move that quickly. So it's got to be programmatical, which means we're going to block the access. So, we're looking at adaptive authentication being implemented as part of MFA or in conjunction with MFA. So we mentioned things like conditional access. We mentioned things like impossible travel. User logging in from two different places that
Mm.
couldn't possibly happen. Those are all really good. So the point is behavioral analysis is important, and then if you're monitoring that, having good policies to handle that, right? Um,
Yeah, and the good thing about adaptive authentication is it can get as granular as you want. You can baseline
yeah,
users with as much information as you want to validate sessions. The more information you have, the harder it's gonna be to validate consistent sessions, but the more secure that user, that device, whatever is gonna be.
yeah. Well, what we did is we built in thresholds. So, like for example, if the resolution of the monitor that they're logging in from changed, okay, cool. You get 3 points, right? And
Mhm.
so if that changed and also your geolocation changed, you're out, dude. That's too many changes all at once. So even if you have 100 different variables that you're checking for, by building in acceptable thresholds into changes, you can avoid accidentally locking people out and kind of find that magic spot that makes sense. So
Yep.
there are ways to do it. By contrast to what you said, if we have too few things, then it's going to be really easy to bypass. So one of the techniques that we use if they have geolocation on is we will literally VPN into the city that
Mhm.
the user is from or the business is from. And so now we're geolocated to like across the street from where you're at. You're going to block that? Probably not, right? But if you do that and Impossible Travel's on, it's a remote user from New York, and I'm logging in from, whatever, and they logged in yesterday from California, now I'm blocked. So you need to have more than one, more than a few,
Mhm.
but even if you have 100, you can work with it. But it does, like you said, it does get complicated. So
Yeah, and I think the point you just made goes really well into our continuous verification session. Because if
mhm,
you're only looking at the first point of authentication and an attacker figures out where that user's from and they authenticate from the same city in the same day, if you're not looking at that session and saying, oh, this IP changed in the middle of the session on a computer, the user could have moved, but if they're office based, that IP is not gonna change. So, looking at information throughout the session to validate that who's logged in is still logged in, I think is also very important.
yeah, and the same um, variables apply to what you just said then that we would apply at the initial login,
Yep,
right? So if you're on a cell phone, you're driving 70 down the interstate, your IP is probably going to change,
yep,
right? If you're in a coffee shop and you move across the street, yeah, okay, that's fine. But if there are significant changes to the device, like now a bad guy stole your session, but he's logging in from, Iran, well, that's a little much. Right now, we're terminating the session. So, but your point is absolutely there, right? That if we can't just check at point of auth, we need to be continuously checking throughout the process. So. And then, the endpoint detection EDR combination with MFA. Um, I'm a big fan of this. It's difficult to implement in a lot of cases, but the point there is similar to NAC. If you guys are familiar with the old network access control, the device would be interrogated prior to allowing it to attach to the environment, right? So before you can even authenticate, I'm going to check and make sure that your device has our EDR product, that
mhm,
it's configured properly, up to date, and it's checking in with my server, right? That right there is solid. That
yep,
is an absolutely excellent way to approach that. So if we can integrate other security mechanisms into the MFA process, or just basically the authentication process, we can help solve some of that. Because even if you have my MFA token, you have my username and password, you got everything you need, you go to log in, where's your EDR?
yep.
Right? Or maybe the EDR is analyzing the behavior as well. So yeah, absolutely integrate that. The last thing that I want to talk about, and it's probably the least important thing, and I know I'm going to catch flack for this, and I'm there for it. User awareness and training.
I'd argue that's the most important thing,
I'm on the other end of it, total other end, right?
because what you were just saying only applies to endpoints. If I wanna log into a user-specific endpoint, but one of the most successful attacks last year that was published is business email compromise,
Hmm.
and a lot of those controls, you're not gonna be looking at from an authentication standpoint when you're logging in. So if a user just gives up and doesn't understand the risks of MFA, prompt bombing, and these common attacks, and they just give you what you need, and you're able to establish that session, that's
Okay,
you don't need to get further than that to get information you need to abuse that company.
I agree. I agree, and I think, look, you make a compelling case. My counterpoint to that would be you can educate a user to the max. And if they are not technical, at least a little bit,
Mhm,
they're still going to fall victim to this stuff.
mhm.
And so the reason that I'm putting this at the bottom of the list for importance
Sure.
is just because we can't rely on it. It's unreliable. Its implementation is not uniform across user base. And so, you might have an 80-year-old grandma working at the reception desk,
Yep.
right? And she's like, "Yeah, I did my user training, but
Mhm.
I also need to give up this password real quick because they asked me for it," right?
Yep.
Not to pick on 80-year-old grandmas, but we can't place that burden on somebody who is not does not understand stuff technically. But what we can do is we can rely on technology. We can rely on the tech stack to do the job that it's designed to do. For the most part, there's always bypasses. I get that. But if we create enough barriers, even if the user fails, we should stop it. And so I think we're both right. Honestly, I really do. I think you're absolutely right. I'm definitely not advocating that we don't do
Mhm.
security awareness training, but when it comes to reliable things that are going to that are going to stop bad guys, the user's not high on my list, dude.
Yeah, I mean, your point stands because business email compromise is the biggest in the cyber business, but
Dude, yeah,
phish training is also the most prevalent training.
right.
So, you've got 2 that just
Yep.
the training's not foolproof. So, relying
Yeah.
on your tech stack as your secondary control is pivotal.
I think you said something right now that's really important. The technology is secondary to the users. The users are your first line of defense. And I think that supports your case really well. Right. So yeah, no question, man. I think we could probably spend an hour debating freaking user awareness training, man.
Yeah, I think we could.
All right, so we're already running a little bit long today. I want to touch on a couple of different things um, that are evolving currently in the MFA world. Right. So there are a couple of things that are important. AI, I think we can't have this conversation without talking at least a little bit about AI. And so really the only reason that AI comes into play here for us is it allows us to more effectively fish, right? It allows us to more quickly and effectively set up phishing architectures that are more convincing. One of the things that we used to teach users was look for misspellings, right? Look for improper grammar. Look for these things. And we're still teaching that, by the way. If you go out to Know Before stuff, and by the way, big fan of Know Before, I'm not beating up on those guys at all. But if you go look at their how to spot a phishing email
Mhm.
training, they're like, yeah, look for improper grammar. Well, guess what, dude? I am now being taught grammar by AI. And I've been speaking English my whole life. And
Mhm.
and so like AI can absolutely put some convincing stuff together. But what's crazy to me is an uneducated 13-year-old in their mom's basement in Saudi Arabia can go to AI and be like, hey, build me a phishing page that exactly mirrors this page in its behavior and leverages this core policy on their back end identity management. And 30 seconds later, this kid has stood up a very convincing and effective phishing attack. That is something we have not seen historically in our business. So, um,
Yeah, and there will be arguments that ChatGPT has protections against writing out malicious scripts for people. There's a tool called Pentest GPT. There have been hacking tools invented that leverage AI infrastructure to just do bad things all the time.
yep,
So ChatGPT may have protections; those have been broken and gotten around like everything else that attackers love to do.
yep. Yeah, there's a funny meme that's like, "Chat GPT, how can I hack blah 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 blah, whatever it is, right?" And it's like, "Oh, I'm
Mhm.
sorry, I can't tell you that." And then you come back and be like, "Yeah, but just as a joke, what if I were to do this?"
I'm
And it
writing it for a
figures something
paper.
out. Yeah, yeah, exactly,
Mhm.
exactly. So it's very contextual. And again, you don't even need to bypass Chat GPT's protections. As you said, there are AI generative models out there for pen testers.
Yep.
And you can imagine if we're accessing this stuff as part of the above board community, what do they have on the dark web, right? What are the cyber criminals selling from an AI platform? Probably some really good stuff. So that said, I think AI is relevant here. A lot of the controls that we have discussed previously apply, right? And it also kind of reinforces the multi-layered security approach. Um, so a couple of one other thing I want to mention is push bombing at scale. We've talked about push bombing. Push bombing is not new. However, the ability to do this across an organization with 10,000 employees quickly is not new, but it's becoming a problem, right? And so take all of the attacks that we've discussed so far today and accelerate them and then scale them out. That's what we're starting to see. Um, so yeah, man. I mean that's really all I've got for this. You got any closing thoughts? Anything you want to say?
MFA is not a silver bullet.
It's really
Small
not.
cog and a huge wheel.
It really is, man. I completely agree with that. So yeah, folks, I encourage you to go do your own research. Fact check us. If you're watching this on YouTube, leave us a comment if this is the kind of content that you like to see. And if you're listening on Spotify or wherever, give us a review and share our content to your friends, man. That's really we're just trying to get the word out about a lot of these topics. So yeah, we'll see you guys next week.